Okay, good evening. Good evening, everybody. Please don't stop eating. You just listen a little bit, and if you want to have seconds, please do so. The food is available, and we have a lot less people than we have expected. As you well know, some of them left for Easter traditional things, I suppose. And but we will begin. We will do the keynote speech. We will do after that. Mr. Ritchie will speak for however long he wants to speak. We will do Q&A, and we will pass the microphone around so that you could ask your questions and hopefully get the answers you're looking for. After that, we will do some thanks to the people that helped us, and to you guys and to your advisors, and then we will do the awards, and that would be, I suppose, a sort of culmination, although the keynote speech really is our culmination here. So, and I'm very much looking forward to it, as I'm sure you are as well. Well, first of all, to introduce our guest, Mark Ritchie. Well, he is Minnesotan, just like myself. I always, when I go visit and I make speeches, and people look at me, I say, don't look too hard. I'm Scandinavian, even though I don't look it, you know. And of course, you know, they don't believe that. And Mr. Ritchie actually comes from Georgia, as we were talking there, and doing a little bit of research, Google research, I suppose, and that he comes from Georgia, and Minnesota is home for both of us, and it's a great state, obviously. And Mr. Ritchie, of course, had a long and has had a long career, particularly in Minnesota. He graduated from Iowa State University. He came and studied at the Humphrey Institute, graduated from that, and came to the public arena after doing business also. In 2005, he won statewide election, became the Secretary of State, ran again and won it again, and probably one of the few politicians that says enough. That's it, term limit here. He chose not to run again, so he retired from that and moved on to other pursuits. He sits on several boards around, and he is currently the president of Global Minnesota. When I invited him, I could sense he was enthusiastic because he knew we're his kind of audience. This is the right people to speak to. He knew that, and so I knew he would be enthusiastic about that, and we are equally thrilled about that. Now, you may not know, and of course some of you are from Michigan or from South Dakota or North Dakota or other states, but you may not know that while Mr. Ritchie was the Secretary of State, there were a lot of interesting things happening. One of them, of course, was the big recall for the Senate seat. It was Al Franken, whom you all know, no doubt, right? Everybody knows Al Franken? Okay, from Saturday Night Live, right? Okay, and so there was basically the recount between him and Coleman, Norm Coleman, and it was one of those textbook cases. Basically, it was really one of the most contested and basically controversial ones. But the way Mr. Ritchie and his office conducted themselves really gave us a model of how you handle these kind of issues. Basically, the difference between them ended up being around 300, just 300 votes. You could imagine. Nevertheless, we're in Minnesota nice things, and it was passed on legitimate, and a lot of people gave a lot of accolades and praise for Mr. Ritchie for how he conducted this, and it is to serve as an example for the rest of the country, not just here in Minnesota. I'm not going to speak about global Minnesota, but they have a website, and I want to give him the opportunity to explain that all that global Minnesota does is it has a long history, and it does a lot of things that certainly appeal to us. That's in fact the reason we were interested in bringing him for us. He has done a lot of work having to do with business identity theft, having to do with elections, voter registration and online registration that puts Minnesota among the top in the country with respect to that. His accomplishments are many, and I don't want to take too much time lest I encroach upon his time to do that, but I trust that some of what he will say will be to introduce a lot of the things that are happening here, whether it's in global Minnesota or in Minnesota at large. Minnesota is a vital state, and there's a lot of things that are happening here globally, global things, and that's really interesting. And one of the things that stayed with me from yesterday's speech by Miss Margot Squire, is that she said she thinks that the representation of Minnesotans in the State Department is quite notable. I don't know, if it was among the highest or not, but she said Minnesota is way overrepresented there. Right? That really speaks well to the state. Speaks well to basically the interest that students and people like us have. We want to be enlightened about what goes on in the world, and that generally is something that works to our advantage as well. So I'm not gonna. I told you I'm not gonna speak at length. I actually have several pages, so I'm gonna basically turn the microphone to Mr. Ritchie, and I do ask you to join me and give a big round of applause to Mr. Ritchie to welcome him to the podium.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you very much. I want to know if this one works. Apparently, I'll put this one in. Doesn't matter. That one works, I'm betting. For that? That works. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And 45 years, it's incredible that you've all been doing this. I know you haven't all been here all the years, but having our region, having our Midwest region, and I know it's many states and some Canadian provinces at times, but this is a very important thing for our country. It's a very important thing for our region, and I know that in this next period, you're already thinking about your 50th anniversary, but also that 75th anniversary of the UN is coming up as well. And so I want to touch a little bit on those things in my remarks this evening. But it's an opportunity for me tonight because I had this incredible experience when the UN turned 50. There was a whole group of people around the country, and there were many things happening about that time. The 50th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference, which some of you know is which gave birth to the World Bank, the IMF, and what eventually became what we now call the WTO. But the birthing of all those different institutions and organizations of the UN, we began talking about how do we acknowledge those, how do we recognize those in our country and in our region. And at that time, I was working in a nonprofit organization, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and we said, well, we should find the founders, the surviving founders. We should gather up the founders of all these organizations and praise them and celebrate them and ask them a lot of hard questions. We had a lot of questions. What was the World Bank doing? What was going on? And what happened in the founding of the UN? And in that experience, I began for the first time to be able to really connect with those individuals who were the founders and the people who brought brought together the pieces that then created the UN and the UN system. And it had many different impacts on me 25 years ago. One of them was that I was really blown away about how Midwesterners were really overrepresented in that process. That was a funny way of talking about there are many Minnesotans in the Foreign Service, but there's many people from the whole region in the Foreign Service. And when you look back on that time, there also was a kind of overrepresentation of our region among the people who were working hard to find out, is there another solution? Is there another way than a third world war? When we gathered those founders 25 years ago, or almost 25 years ago, without exception, whether it was the World Bank gathering at Bretton Woods and IMF, or the UN gathering, which we did in San Francisco at the Opera House, or the founding of the Food and Agriculture Organization, it did not matter. In each instance, the language of the founders was, hey, we lived through 2 world wars, the incineration of 2 cities with newly developed terrifying weaponry of nuclear power. We had to find some other way. We had to find some other way. And there were many ideas about what to do and how to do that, and there were many ideas about underlying conditions and human rights and hunger and all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, what took me and my imagination was this universal understanding that they came to the conclusion that we were going to continue to have world wars, or we were going to end the practice of world war, and they were trying to find out what could be that framework, or how would we do that. But as I took on the fact that our region, Midwestern region, this whole part of the country was kind of overrepresented, I used a part of my brain that is my high school history teacher. Somebody asked me what I went to university in, and I started in hard science and I ended up in history. Happily, I like both. But in that process, I began to take a look at who were some of the leaders, some of the critical voices. And one of the things that I noted was that our region was often represented in the work of creating a United Nations and other organizations that address the same issues by really ordinary people, but who were committed to doing extraordinary things. And so the first of our Nobel Peace Prize winners from our region was somebody who I think finished 4th or 5th grade, but that was it for his education. And he grew up and studied and followed the craft of law and was a lawyer over here about an hour east of us in Rochester. Frank Kellogg is his name. And some of you might have heard of the Kellogg Brand Pact, and there's a Kellogg House, and there's a lot of Kellogg Boulevards, and he's celebrated in many ways and different aspects of his life. But never really has he, in a way, had the kind of acknowledgement, or I would say the notoriety. But here's the first person who, as Secretary of State, he was Secretary of State for Coolidge, he took up the idea, this was in the aftermath of the First World War, that we needed to find a way that the great nations that were the source of the big conflicts, who were competing for markets, who were competing for raw materials and colonies and land, we had to find a way to come to an agreement to abolish war and to commit ourselves to using non-violent methods, non-violent approaches to working out our differences. And for his contribution and for his initiation of that pact, and that first one was the United States proposal to France. So that's where the Kellogg Brand Pact came in. They stated in their granting of him his Nobel Prize that they read out loud when they were giving him the Nobel Prize the opening of this agreement, which is that the government of the United States is prepared to consort with the government of France with the view that the conclusion of a treaty must be made among the principal powers of the world, open to signature by all nations, condemning war and renouncing it as an instrument of national policy in favor of the peaceful settlement of international disputes. So, a young man, not highly educated or not educated at all past elementary school, living over here in Rochester, rose in our society to Secretary of State and rose in the stature of an international leader and brought forth this agreement, this Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was the first time this was really said in an official way in a really public setting. And for that, he was named the Nobel Peace Laureate for that time. And it's interesting because he was playing off a kind of understanding that people had that the First World War was not only a really horrible war, and I don't know how many of you have seen Peter Jackson's remake and colorizing of a lot of World War I footage that's now out, They Shall Not Grow Old. But anyhow, that war was horrific at a level that was, shocking to all. I mean, it was the war to end all wars, and it in fact turned out to be the seeds of future wars and future conflicts. But he was pointing a lot to President Wilson, who was a strong voice for peace and was an advocate for the League of Nations and others. But Wilson also was no fool, and he was pretty clear about how he viewed that war. And in a speech that he gave in St. Louis in 1919, so this is right after the war, kind of in the run-up to the elections, this is President Wilson. Why, my fellow citizen, is there any man here? Is there any woman here? Let me say, is there any child here that does not know that the seeds of war in the modern world is industrial and commercial rivalry? The real reason that war we have finished took place was that Germany was afraid her commercial rivals were going to get the better of her. And the reason that so many nations went to war against Germany was that they thought that Germany would gain a commercial advantage over them. Wilson knew and said out loud what many, many people were thinking. These wars, these large global world wars, were competitions played out in violent form between the great powers for commercial industrial rivalry. And so he was saying, and Frank Kellogg was addressing the notion that there must be another way. If it's commercial rivalry, what else can we do? And there was a movement in the Midwest and in other parts of the country to do something about that. And it was a very, very important reflection of who we were as a region. But it isn't just that this idea kind of dropped from the sky in his head, or there was something special about him. He was a special person, but an ordinary person in many ways. But I think it's clear that our region, because we were a region where millions of people had come from all over the world, essentially fleeing the negative or the terrible impacts of these great power conflicts. As a region, we had a kind of wisdom about this that gave us some pause in the idea that we're just going to go on having world wars forever. Many, many people came here just for a better life. Where they were living was being destroyed by wars or by famines caused by war or by whatever else was destroying their way of life. And they came here to flee that to create a better life. Other people came here directly as a result of these giant wars and conflicts. The number of people, my last name is Ritchie, it's a Scottish last name, but in fact my grandfather's last name was Richter, the German name. And his employer in the U.S. didn't want any Germans working at his place, and so we just changed our name. But so many people came here to avoid being drafted by the Kaiser. And they say it out loud. I'm here because I was afraid, I was opposed to, I didn't want to, whatever word they wanted to use. So there was also the flood of people who immigrated here who were directly coming because of those wars, those endless wars between two countries or a few countries or the World War. And finally, there were also many, many people who came here to be free of a kind of oppression or oppression that was something that was core to their personal values. They wanted to worship their God in their way, and they were seeking freedom of religion. They were living in serf-like conditions, and they were escaping slavery. They came here because they saw that this was a place where their values could be expressed. And so this region had some experience with these great power conflicts, with these wars. And many people came here because they didn't like them. They came here because they destroyed their way of living or their way of life. They came here because they were going to be drafted or shipped off to war to kill somebody who was their cousin. Or they came here because the oppression that is part of the mechanisms that come out of those wars were obstacles to them being able to be the dignified human being they wanted to be and to express their rights, their human rights, and their freedoms directly. So in our region, we had a lot of people who had a lot of experience and opinions about these wars, but they also expressed that in their willingness to defend themselves or to defend freedom in ways that were quite unusual and in fact part of our state and our region's history. It's famously known that Minnesotans were the first to volunteer to go fight slavery to defend the Union in the Civil War. But it's not as well known about how big of a conflict there was about that within our state, because there's always different views and different opinions. In fact, some of the people who came here fleeing the wars of Europe and fleeing oppression, their commitment inside of their souls was to make sure that others could enjoy that same benefit. And they were, part of the community. Some of you know our Governor Quee. We have Governor Quee was one of our governors, still alive, quite old now, and still active. But his grandfather was a Norwegian-speaking bachelor farmer in southeast Minnesota, and when he read about what was going on with slavery and the Dred Scott decision, he went off in the Minnesota 1st Sharpshooters, was very severely wounded, and sent home from the Battle of Antietam, and spent the rest of the war basically rounding up other bachelor Norwegian farmers and saying, we have a principle in our religious culture and our values to defend freedom and to oppose slavery, and convincing them to join the Union Army. That war was a long ways from here, and he got chased away by a lot of moms with bullwhips. There's some incredible story. But the point here is that people came here, and some portion of them saw it as their responsibility to help defend that which they were here to benefit from. But there were others who believed that pulling up the drawbridge and being isolationist was one of the conclusions they reached when they came here. Hey, we got land of milk and honey, we got really good farmland, we've got water, it's kind of peaceful, we've got this and that. We don't want more people coming here, or we don't want to attack our brothers and sisters in the South. And that tension has been something that remains till today, but it played a very important role in our region's participation in the mechanisms of building peace. Frank Kellogg was one of the first of the Nobel Prize winners from our region. The second one was a very amazing woman, Jane Addams from Chicago, who is famous in our culture or in our world as being the founder of the Hull House and really the creator of the movement of settlement houses, which were there to address some of the terrible economic conditions being faced by new immigrants and people who were unemployed with the industrialization and the change of our economy. But she also was a tireless international advocate for peace. And Jane Addams was one of the most important people who made the connection that now, we kind of have on a bumper strip. If you want peace, work for justice, that way of thinking. Jane Addams said it loud, said it clear, and said it over the whole planet, that we have to address the economic conditions and the social justice conditions and the human rights condition, because those are some of the seeds, some of the causes of war. And for her work, she was honored with a Nobel Peace Prize. After her came a few others in our region, some others also from Canada. But is there anybody here tonight from Canada? One. Yes. The Canadian Prime Minister, Pearson, was the ambassador to the United States right at the end of the Second World War and was a critical person in the founding of the United Nations. And twice he was nominated to be the Secretary General. He was an incredible leader for peace. Twice he was vetoed and blocked. It was a loss for the humanity, a loss for all citizens. But the Canadians shared much of the same values of our region, both the necessity to fight for freedom and the importance of building the institutions to try to preserve the peace, to address the social injustices, and to make change. And while he was Prime Minister in Canada, many things happened, the national health insurance, the national pension. I mean, he really tackled the causes of misery and injustice, but also was the strong, strong voice for freedom and for peace and for the United Nations, the institution created to try to sustain the peace that people knew must exist. Also from our region, another Nobel Peace Prize winner, name was John Mott. Probably haven't heard of John Mott, but he's from a couple hours over here, Pottsville, Iowa. And as a young man, he was involved in the student movement between campuses, between the United States and Canada, as part of the YMCA and part of their kind of internationaling of their thinking. And he began to see that there was power in young people being linked together across borders, and he began advocating for the creation of international student associations with the support of the YMCA. And one of the things that he did in 1911 was to create the first organization, and I always get the name of it a little bit wrong. Let's see if I can find it. Yes. The Committee on Friendly Relations Among Foreign Students. What a great name. And his concept was that we had to actively work to bring students together across, because some of the older people had a habit of just creating wars all the time, and that we needed to think differently, and that young people were the critical factor in that. And so John Mott became the central person in the creation of organizations here in the United States and around the world that were the kind of touch point. When students came from other countries, those organizations would welcome them. They spent a lot of time in their early materials talking about meeting people at steamships. It's wonderful. But also in organizing events in the community and events in the broader world of those students. And actually, the organization I work for today, Global Minnesota, was born out of that same movement that John Mott, this young student from Pottsville, Iowa, who was working for the YMCA, was the creator of in 1911. And when he was given the Peace Prize by the Nobel Institute, they had this to say about his contribution. Let's see if I can find it. They cited his work, especially among young people, and they said that his work for peace, which was devoted to inspiring young people, was what was his critical factor that made him deserving of that Nobel laureate. And they put it this way in his nomination: his work has always been chiefly among youth, for in them, in you, lies the future. They are the leaders of tomorrow. You are the leaders of tomorrow. The spirit that John Mott represented, that moved the hearts of young, will one day fashion the world. And so John Mott, a young man from Pottsville, Iowa, who dedicated his life to finding ways to connect students from around the world to build peace and understanding, was recognized because they knew his work was inspiring the young who would create and fashion the future. I note that the theme of this conference is inspiring young people to be global citizens. To me, that's a fantastic theme. But the fact that the Nobel Committee saw that work in a young boy at the time, a young man from a little town just a couple hours over from here, is a kind of recognition that it's ordinary people doing extraordinary things that are the hope for the future. It's what we have. And in this moment of time where there's a lot of struggle about international affairs, you open the morning newspaper and you can just turn every page, we have a kind of population or neighborhood or neighbors somewhat on high alert. There's more attention to global issues right now than in a long time. There also are organizations like the work you're doing here, like Global Minnesota where I work, like the YMCA, like many others, who are there to help channel, help do education, advance understanding, channel engagement. There are also, at this point in time, new social media, new digital tools, new ways of doing things that make it possible for all of the mechanisms that might be thrown up to pit people against each other. We have ways of connecting, but we also have new ideas and new approaches to global work that really are coming out of the next generations. This little pen of mine is a representation of the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Some of you know that in 2015, all the heads of state, without exception, signed the agreement that by 2030 we would try to achieve 17 sustainable development goals, and they were very specific. And so there's 17 of them. I happen to have chosen to work on bringing a World's Fair to Minnesota on one of them about health. And I'm very personally involved in one of them specifically within health, 3.6, SDG 3.6, reducing traffic fatalities and injuries by half. But in that notion of the global goals for sustainable development, there is the beginning of a new way of thinking about how we govern ourselves, how we interact at a global level. It's sometimes called governance by goals, not too inventive of a term, but the idea is that we put some goals out there. Kyoto on our climate change goals, and now the Paris Accord, the Sustainable Development Goals. We put out the goals, and all of us together work to achieve those goals. This is a breakthrough in how we can begin to build that future that John Mott and others were out struggling to inspire and who were recognized by that Nobel Prize. But these are examples of people who found ways in their lives to make a difference out of an ordinary life doing extraordinary things, and they have come full circle to this moment now where we all get to kind of see, do we have the courage to take the risk to make that first step, the second step, and to move our humanity in a different direction. And there was one other Midwesterner who's just from up the road here a little bit. He was the youngest governor we ever had in this state, Governor Stassen. And he was a Republican in a time when the Republican Party was very, very isolationist. The most famous person on the planet was our own Charles Lindbergh. Made that courageous flight across the ocean. He was the most famous person on the planet, and of course the most famous Minnesotan in the process. Very devoted to isolationism, and was really, in a way, kind of enthralled by what was happening in Hitler's Germany. And Governor Stassen, with his kind of practical Midwestern view, really thought that was wrong, was young enough to be on a path to be considered to run for president, and had been asked to make the keynote address at the Republican National Convention. And this was the 1940 convention. It was in Philadelphia. It was hotly contended. Some of you remember that that keynote address is really the place where Barack Obama broke through, where, you know, it's the key thing. And his speech is often called "The Lights Are Going Out in Europe." It's a direct attack on the isolationism within his party. It was a direct appeal to what was happening with the rise of Hitler and the march of Nazism across Europe and Latin America and the rest. And it was a plea to abandon that isolation and to face the reality of what was going on in Europe and to begin finding a way to do something about it. He was a man of peace and very devoted to peace, and he actually, his whole life was that. But in this instance, he saw that Nazi march as the greatest threat to world peace, and he saw his party's isolationism and their America Firstism as a direct aid to that march of Hitler, and he took it on. It is incredibly courageous. But he came back home, was governor-elect again, did some amazing things, and then Pearl Harbor happened. And he did two things. One of them was, you know, we have a Festival of Nations in Minnesota, happens every year. Pearl Harbor happened right in the middle of the planning. Everybody was kind of in a complete like ruckus, and they were going to bust the whole thing up, and he came back and said, no. Yes, we're at war with Germany, we're at war with Japan, we're at war with Italy, we have all of these things going on, but this is the time we need this Festival of Nations more than ever before, because we are together here. And he prevailed. But he also said, after the Pearl Harbor attack, that he was going to get his budget passed, and then he was going to quit the job of being governor and go off and fight the march of totalitarianism, and that's what he did. Got his budget passed, he quit, and he went to the Pacific, and he served and was a hero in the war in the Pacific. But President Roosevelt had noticed that this articulate young Republican leader had been so strong in his call for a united front, but an organization of peace to be built. And Roosevelt instructed him to come back. He was on, I think, the USS Missouri as the XO, the executive officer. And he said, no, I'm at war. We got work to do here. And I think the president then ordered him, if I remember the story. He came back. Some of you know the story. He was one of the 5 of the U.S. delegation. He was the central creator from the U.S. government side of the United Nations, founder of the United Nations in all kinds of ways. In this book by a young student who was there helping to create the UN, she refers to him, written in 1946, as the darling of the civil society and the citizens who were there because he cared about human rights, poverty, the issues that they cared about. So he was off to war to fight the Nazis and totalitarianism, came back to help create the institution that he and everyone else prayed would stop this madness of these global wars. Went back to his duty. I think he was involved in rescuing prisoners of war in Japan. Eventually he came home, and when he came home, he found out that there were 2 senators who had voted against the United Nations in Washington. One from Minnesota. We talk about Minnesota nice, but He went and recruited a candidate and took him out. That's another form of Minnesota nice. You be nice to me, I'd be nice to you. You mess with my UN, I take you out. And he did. And he also spent most of the rest of his life making very specific suggestions about ways that we could continue to make the UN stronger, more modern, more advanced. So this was an ordinary Minnesotan. The youngest governor was an attorney, but who had a life dedicated to world peace that also took him through the heart of one of the most horrific wars, which had a really horrific ending. And so this is how we are as a people. We have life experiences and we find our way. We get ourselves into a good position. Some of us say, I got a good position, pull up the drawbridge. We got some of that going on in the country. But some of us say, you know, what's in my soul, what my Creator tells me to do, is that we're all in this together. And if there's a war against slavery, or if there's a war against the Nazis, or if there's a threat to human rights anywhere, I need to put myself in harm's way to be consistent with those values. So there's something in the life experience of how we end up where we are in life, and then we have some choices and challenges to make about how we choose to spend the whatever the number of days that we're given. We have those choices. I'm really proud to be part of a region and part of a place where those who've come before us have been ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and I'm really thrilled that some of them got recognized and got Nobel Prizes and got acknowledged, and that we have their stories to really, guide us. But I'm also aware that they were expecting that those of us who came behind them wouldn't just appreciate them and honor them and talk about them and kind of go our merry way, but that we would understand that they were investing in us with the expectation that we would be investing for those who come next. So in the theme of this conference about inspiring young people to be global citizens, I hope tonight I've been able to share with you some ways that I was inspired to be a global citizen by those who've come before me. And in our conversation just for a few minutes here, I've been inspired by more of you. And I hope that we can have a conversation and some question and answer, and we can find ways that we can work together in this next decade. It's the 75th anniversary of everything related to the Second World War and everything related to the UN. It's the 250th anniversary of the nation. There's a lot of interesting things there. In 2030, it's the culmination of the Sustainable Development Goals campaign. And there's many other things that will be happening. You will be going out into the world and taking leadership positions in nonprofits, in corporations, in government, in the Foreign Service, all kinds of places. I look forward to making sure that we find the ways to stay connected. So as we inspire each other, we begin to give new definition to what a global citizen is. It's somebody who keeps in mind the local and the global at the same moment, and finds ways to be helpful and to ask for help in each of those moments when the thing that's needed is the courage that comes from the way that people connect together with each other. We talk a lot about individuals, and even in the language, a global citizen, and we do things for ourselves and by ourselves in life, but really we're a society, we're a people, we're a humanity, we're one planet. We got to do it together. Thank you so much for making this for 45 years. I can't wait to see 46. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we will do a Q&A. If you want to raise your hand, I'll run around and we will get to as many as we can.
So being college students, I feel like many of us kind of maybe limited in our scope, at least in this period in time. I'm just wondering what you think some like grassroots level things that we could do would be to make us more inclined to become global citizens.
So I think there's some things that just come like right to mind because they're a little bit self-evident, but there's a few others. Like, for example, just flat out hospitality. So there's 1,500 international students here. There's students from other parts, but the aspect of kind of organized friendship or organized kindness is super important. I know at Global Minnesota about 2 months ago, we got a call from the Iranian Student Association on campus at the U at the Twin Cities, and they were feeling very isolated, very attacked, very alone. And we just were brainstorming about what we could do, and the thing that we came up with immediately was getting all of them invited out to homes and families for dinner and just for conversation, and it was transformative for how they felt. That doesn't change the administration and the rules and the fact they can't bring their spouses over and they can't see their, I mean, it does, but it was it had a big impact. So the human social things is one thing. The second thing is, you can respond to things in the newspaper and on social media. I wouldn't say like that, but with just a little bit of thinking about what's the right way to phrase the zinger that I want to make here, and then injecting it into the larger conversation, because a big part of my speech I didn't talk about tonight is it's just about how I feel like our nation has well-meaning people who are somehow adopting the language of confrontation and enemy, etc., with other great powers like China and Europe and Cuba. And I feel like there's something going on where there's a reversion to the notion that we should be in this world as a as a competition that's about win-loss. And I do think well, this is a really serious matter in a world that's loaded with nuclear weapons, and just like it's a serious matter in a country where a lot of people are armed, you know what I mean? So things that confront and challenge, and sometimes it takes real courage because it's kind of it's rhetoric even from like good friends of mine, so it's a little crazy making, but responding in a way with the notion like, not that disrespects, but raises a larger question like, we've been there before with that, they're the enemy stuff, and really painting one brush about a whole country I'd hate it if they all thought we thought like everybody in Washington, or I don't know, I'm making it up. But the final thing is, there are many different ways to get overseas and have experiences. And long before I took this job at Global Minnesota, I would say, if somebody was asking me this sort of general question, and as a politician, you get asked a lot of questions, and so I was like, well, what's your one thing you would do, or something like that, if you were a genie and you could do anything you want to. And I would say I'd take my magic wand and I would make sure every young person had the opportunity to live overseas, and every young person overseas had the opportunity to come here and live. I just think it is transformative. And so finding ways to work or tour or visit or hitchhike or whatever, but also making that a circle of friendship that then brings somebody here. Or maybe your home had a foreign exchange student and there's a kind of a family connection over someplace else. I don't know exactly, but whatever it takes, and then looking for the opportunities in being able to be in service in an overseas way. Many Minnesota companies have parts of their operations overseas. I mean, it's kind of the nature of the beast, medical and that kind of stuff. But I'm just saying that there are many different opportunities that can make it possible to get overseas and to be living in another culture. And in my mind, it just kind of starts you off on a process. One of the things we do at Global Minnesota is try to make sure that we do a lot of public events so that people can go up and meet people who they've read their books or they, that kind of thing, because then, people are unbelievably generous, and I think sometimes we're all kind of shy or something like that. But we try to do these events at Global Minnesota so you don't feel intimidated to go up and say, hey, you're out in Washington and I'm going to be there next week. Can I take you for a cup of coffee? And they'll say yes, because they're nice people, but also, and those kinds of things where they've done this, and then let's say you can't go, but you can call them on Skype, because sometimes you can't go, or sometimes you're hoping to go. I'm hoping to go to Washington in 2 weeks. Can I, and then things don't work out. And so anyhow, it's to say that there are organization times. And I have to say, I looked at one of the walls with all the flyers for here. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Pretty amazing stuff. And so, you're also supposed to be studying and doing papers and probably working on the conference and, whatever. But I also just think that when there are opportunities to be physically gathering to do that, and there's a bunch of them here and a bunch up in the Twin Cities and in other places.
Perfect. More question? Did you point to me? Okay.
There's one in the back. Yep.
Is this on? Okay. So towards the end of your speech, you talked a lot about focusing on local issues, right? And since a lot of us don't have a lot of experience with working with groups to solve local issues, I was wondering if you could give us some examples of local issues that Minnesota faces today.
So I tend to think about this from two sides, so to speak. There's a group on campus, ASHI? How do you say it? ASAC. So ASAC is a student-created organization. It's 70 years old, older than Global Minnesota, and it connects people by asking, what's your passion? They ask which of the 17 of the sustainable goals is your passion, hunger or water or whatever. And then they connect people by the passion of the issue. And I think, a lot of people in this particular, I'm thinking about the emails that came to me today. There's a lot of concern about the way that food waste and spoilage creates problems for water and problem for land and soil, and also people are hungry. And so there's giant social movements coming out of Brazil and Italy and other places. I think they use the term social gastronomy, but anyhow, it's about the notion of addressing that one issue. So I think that there are organizations that take on a specific issue, and so that's part of passion. But the other side of it is I'm always trying to figure out who's making it clear that it's the engagement that's the bottom line, because issues come and go, but if you are committed to being a voter every time, if you're committed to turning out for public events where that's important, if the organization encourages you to be a well-rounded and full citizen engaged, then in fact it can take you into places or issues that you had never thought about. One night, in the middle of the night, was completely swept into the issue of drunk driving and the loss and the war against each other on the roads. And so your interest or your focus can change suddenly, but if the core is about being engaged in the community and trying to make the community a better place in whatever way, then organizations can help you make that happen. Now, I also had the experience of a young woman who got recruited to come to Minnesota to work for Land O'Lakes. So Land O'Lakes is a cooperative. They had a division that did economic development work in the third world, I think Kenya, Ethiopia, I'm not sure, in East Africa. Anyhow, she got hired to run one of those projects. She comes over to my office and she says, where's the organization? of young people who want to work overseas, want to do development work overseas, that kind of thing. And I thought about it, and I go, God, that is really a good question. And I said, I don't think it exists. You're going to have to start it. And so she went back. Land O'Lakes gave her 20% of the time and a pile of money, and she created an organization called Minnesota International NGO Network, which is, I think, about 1,000 mostly young people who want to work in international work, who support each other, and as an organization, that's what they do. So she was looking for something that was really important and didn't exist, and kind of amazingly, it didn't exist. And she had the capacity at that moment to then create it. And now, she's kind of a senior advisor, and it goes on. But that model, which is to say that when a kind of structure is needed and it's not there, then there is the possibility of creating it. I do highly recommend looking at the website often it's just called MIN, but it's Minnesota International NGO Network. They do amazing things, and they have a lot of connectivity and statewide things. But it's an example for me of somebody taking the bull by the horns and making it happen.
You had a question, correct?
Hi, I'm from South Dakota, and I just had a question. We've had similar incidents to international students feeling isolated, but we don't have Global Minnesota. So I was wondering if you were thinking of expanding your organization.
So this is, so I'm in the middle of a conversation with our colleagues that are in Nebraska and in North Dakota. And I noticed in that map when I was talking to these folks, there wasn't somebody in South Dakota, so I'm thinking about this. And I would love to get your contact information and have a conversation about this, because I actually spend a lot of time with the people from Sanford Health, because we're working on this World's Fair on health and medicine. Sanford Health is a pretty big horse, doing amazing things all over, and working in Ghana and working in India. I mean, getting awards from the Pope. So anyhow, it turned out I'm in Sioux Falls a lot, and it made me, so when I looked at the map and realized there wasn't something there, I thought, wait a minute, this isn't right. So I'd like to be in touch with you to talk about, there's some models of how this can happen that we could do fairly quickly and fairly easily. But our colleagues in Nebraska and North Dakota also have some very interesting ideas, and I've been learning, kind of how they approach. I'm from a little town in central Iowa, and there's a lot going on there just because it's kind of at a crossroads. But my colleagues out in western Nebraska, it's kind of isolated, and so they've done some really good things that I thought were really smart. So afterwards, I'll come find you, and we'll make a connection, and then we'll begin to figure out what to do. I mean, you guys hosted this conference a few years ago when George McGovern came. That's like a big deal, and there are there's incredible leaders over there that we could connect with and figure out. So I'm so glad you asked, and we will connect.
Are you up for another question? Are you okay? I didn't hear no.
Hi. I have extensive familial relations where they've been affected by drunk driving, and I was really curious when you mentioned that you were involved in SDG 3.6 as to how you would address the issue of combating traffic fatalities, and what you thought about that.
Thank you for the question. Well, so I'll give you one of my stories, and Cargill, it's a big company. It has recently gotten a kind of change of senior leadership. There's a new CEO. I'm not sure exactly how all of this started, but as a company, they began to say, we want to internally be the safest company on the planet. And one of our measurements is going to be deaths on the job. and they open their board meetings by going through how they're doing. And they're, you know, they take seriously this. I mean, it's a very deep thing within their company. And they use the language of every one of our employees' loved ones have a right to expect that their loved one will come home every night. So it's deep. And so they were looking at their deaths on the job. Half came from car crashes, motorcycle, trucks. I mean, you know, it's a big company, it's all over the world. Half of those came from distracted driving. And so the big boss took his cell phone and put it in his glove box for a month, unbeknownst and unannounced to people, and realized that he felt better, it was safer, and the main boss of a gigantic, world's largest private corporation did fine. And so he then banned cell phone use during the day and at night if you have a Cargill phone, even if you're in your own car, and began the process of changing the culture inside the organization, because they have salesmen who, you know, must have it, and, you know, there's all these things. So he then became a very eloquent spokesperson at large meetings of CEOs of big companies, and I watched him one day say, he was getting an award for something, and he said, now I got one more thing to say. I want to all of you, and, you know, it's 500, you know, runners of the 500 biggest, and he said, I want you to put that cell phone into your glove box. You deserve to get home. Your family deserves to have you home. Everybody else on the road deserves to be safe. Put that in your glove box. And it was like, you know, not exactly how people might in Minnesota Nice have taken that situation, but he did it. So I say that story only to say that if you're that big of a company and have that big of a bully pulpit, you will affect the numbers on road fatalities and injuries through that action. So that's like mega action. I've taken it in my own life by getting active in MAD and being active in the process of getting laws changed and getting enforcement. And we just had a big success with some part of the distracted driving law, you know, that kind of thing. So that's a kind of individual thing that I can do. MAD's an organization, and, you know, it's kind of organized. But in between those two extremes, I also got very active in the organization that's the nonprofit that's the coordinator for organ transplants. My daughter's heart is in a young woman in the Twin Cities who we're friends with, and that fact didn't bring my daughter back to me, but it gave me my life back. And so I believe that in the way that we take these sustainable development goals and we do everything we can, we remain humans and things happen. And then we find the ways to do what we can. And in that context, then we make ourselves vulnerable and we share so that others can find a way back to their lives. In MAD, one of the things we do is these victims panel. Drunk drivers have to listen to how it feels. It has an impact, you know, not a solution, but it has an impact. Getting people to check the box to say, if something happens to me, I want to donate, does change lives at many different levels, but it especially changes the lives of the person left behind, the loved one who no longer has their daughter. So I find that 3.6, in fact, I was with the head of government relations for 3M. You know, 3M is a big company, but they make all the signs in the world, all the street signs. And he knew 3.6 like this. I mean, he was kind of like a walking encyclopedia of all the things happening on the planet on 3.6, and it made me happy. because I'm doing my little thing, and and then Cargill is kind of a big thing, but this guy knew the whole world. So I feel like one of the genius things about the Sustainable Development Goals is that if we share what we're doing, even if it's tiny or big, then the rest of us feel like, oh, that's great. We're gonna get there. We're gonna get there someday. And Minnesota has a whole Towards Zero Death initiative about engineering and education, and there are different things that I think are super. But I have to say, being able to focus in on that one makes me able to listen with active interest to somebody else who's deep into 7.9. And so I can be involved in these really funny conversations about stuff I know nothing about, but I'm super interested in what this passionate person is doing over here in gender equity or in underused water. So I don't know if that's helpful in terms of it, but we all kind of find a way.
Thank you. How about two more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Who would like to ask the next question?
We could take them both, and then I'll tackle them that way.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, since we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, how do you, obviously through your own life experiences and through your work, you were able to get involved with this amazing organization and get involved with something that you were really passionate about. How does somebody who is still in school, what is the best way for me or any of my colleagues to get involved with something as big with the UN?
Yeah. So let me tackle the Sustainable Development Goals specifically and go a little further. Specifically in Minnesota, we've created a Sustainable Development Goals Roundtable for people to share what they're doing, and it has been a kind of an open-ended thing. So, for example, there's lots of students from different places, and it's a way to get ideas of what other students are doing. And it turns out that other campuses were doing, I think Hamlin had a course for all the freshmen. It was an SDG, kind of a seminar or something like that. So anyhow, that people can email me, or I can get the list and send everybody a note. But that Sustainable Development Roundtable helped spawn a number of presentations, and so organizations began to present what they're doing. The Economic Development Council for 9 counties around Fergus Falls adopted the Sustainable Development Goals as their central guide to their economic development planning for the region. And so, they're kind of way out in front, but it's an example that people are starting to take this on and to do it. But I know that we have to raise the visibility and also make this sort of in the media sense different. And so I didn't mention it, I have it in there, but I didn't mention it. We're going to make October sort of global month because there's all kinds of things. The Nobel Peace Prize Forum, which normally happens towards the end of this year, it's the Human Rights Forum, and it's kind of the last week. We're going to do an SDG week, the week that has World Food Day in the middle, so kind of like the 14th to the 17th, that kind of thing. And so it's going to be kind of wide open, like Startup Week or something. People will do different things, and we'll be able to kind of support each other and say, down at Mankato, they're doing this. They're doing an SDG workshop, and they're having the speaker. There's a younger woman from Columbia who wrote them and lobbied them globally. She's the reason we have them, and she's now working in D.C., and I think we can get her out here for that week, and she's incredible, So part of having an SDG week is that means that people everywhere can do something and say it's part of this thing, and then the newspapers get a little more interested because, it's that. There are also either one and in some cases 2 week-long meetings in New York around the UN, which is kind of the Wild West time for SDGs. And so I was running down the hallway at the last one, and there was a sign that said SDG 18, and I stopped because I thought, oh no, I've been telling people there's 17. And what it was that the country of Laos, and they had these 6 really articulate young people there at their big table, had taken the technique of saying, we need one more SDG in Laos. To protect our lives, we need to remove UXOs, which is the word for unexploded ordnances. They said, yes, you left 41 million unexploded bombs and landmines in our country, and we need some help to remove those landmines and those unexploded ordnances from our country for our kids to be safe. And they had pictures of using rats to find them and dogs. I mean, you know, but it was so sophisticated how they were using the SDGs to make a point about something. And so those weeks have a lot of exciting ideas, and the SDG Roundtable is doing a little plan to see if there's a way to find some foundation that'll pump out and help a group of young people get there, spend a week kind of, because there's young people from the whole planet, as a way to come back with ideas about, you know, what could be done next. So we'll find a way to make sure everybody can get a hold of me, but I'm typically easy to get a hold of, and then I'm also tell people don't be shy. But I'd like to get all of you a way that you can connect, because Global Minnesota can keep you informed, and the SDG is a kind of a special thing within that. And in my mind, that's one of the straightest paths for direct contact with the UN that I know of. Thank you. You got one more?
Yeah, do we have one more question? Somebody have one come into their mind?
Thank you all very much. Thank you to the organizers.
Thank you, Mr. Ritchie. Isn't it great to escape the world of academia, I guess, abstract stuff, and to enter the world of the real world, I suppose. Practical advice, great practical advice. And if it is any comfort, I will tell you that I teach class on international organization. And I make sure to mention a few Minnesotans, including the ones you mentioned. Brian Clark, even one you didn't mention by name, Shipstead, Henrik Shipstead. Yes, yeah, he was one from Minnesota and the other was from North Dakota. Okay, and of course Charles Stassen, the famous Charles Stassen, who ran for president many times. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. It's an honor to have you here and to be with us. It is an inspiring speech, and I know your organization does internships, and hopefully some of our students at one point will end up with an internship there. So I very much appreciate it. Another round of applause for our guest, please. Okay, thank you. Well, first I want to thank all of you for attending today. I know many of you thought twice about it because you had to think what to do with the family, basically, because of Easter. So your being here is a testimony to the importance of this. And I want to begin also by thanking all of the advisors that brought you here. It takes a lot of work to put this effort together, to organize it, and believe me, none of us is paid for that. It's really out of zeal and interest and enthusiasm and I guess perhaps hope that somehow we'll impart something positive that will inspire you and you take it on forward. State University. We have many here. Who is the president from Lake Superior State University. Raise your hand, make some noise. Okay. Your advisor is Dr. Melissa Schaefer, of course. That Lake Superior State University is one of the founders of this model a long time ago. And so Melissa is basically third generation in this regard. Minnesota State University Moorhead, who is from Moorhead. Okay, and Andrew Conte, of course, also he's an old-timer, I suppose. He wasn't the founder, but an old-timer. Retired only a few years back and was one of the most enthusiastic about this program and the model and the organization. And so I'm sure you miss him. I don't know if you met him or not, but certainly we miss him as a colleague of ours. And South Dakota State University, Dr. David Wilson, of course. First, Dr. David. Give him a big round of applause. Dr. Elizabeth Cleeks. From Northern. They deserve that. Did I miss anybody else? Is there any other advisor that is here? Dr. Mimi, of course, went with their students. They actually told me it was very difficult for them to even come for the other days because they do attend Easter services. And so I think some students from Gustavus are here still. Is anybody here from Gustavus? Okay. Well, he is Muslim, so he's not attending Easter. And maybe that's why. Well, we thank you very much, and we appreciate you coming. Hopefully you enjoyed your being here. This really offers a good meal. And perhaps, getting to know people and to interact with them. As our guest indicated, that this is quite valuable to interact with others and to learn from them and to share experiences, and you can grow healthier, I guess, as a human being, as an individual, as a citizen. This is really important for all of us. What we will do here is basically we want to thank the people that have helped us, and Rachel is going to come and help me, knowing that I'm not very good with names, meaning I sometimes confuse them. So Rachel is going to help me with that. After that, I think what we're going to do is do basically the awards. Okay? So here's Rachel.
Hi. I would like to give a huge shout out to Alexander Prom, who applied himself and threw himself fully into organizing this conference as the conference coordinator. Anything we needed of him, he did it immediately, and he is running on 1 hour of sleep, and he is an absolute rock star. And so please a round of applause for Alex. Next, a shout out to Lyndon Carlson, the United Nations International Relations Club president on campus. I am proud to serve as his vice president for the club. He, as well as Alex, have organized this. I feel like I have done nothing for this, and all of the credit goes to those two gentlemen. So please, for Lyndon. Thank you to our special guest, Kevin Chang, for coming. He is a student at the University of Minnesota, and he served as chair of the Political and Security Committee. We were so happy to have you here, so please for Kevin. Also, he mentioned the other advisors, but please give a round of applause to Dr. Battah for organizing this and putting up with our craziness and disorganization, and we made a great weekend, so thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And And last but not least, of course, is Rachel. She tells me I call her Sarah. So from now on, I'm going to make sure that I call her Rachel Iverson, who actually I asked her to, I hadn't asked her at the beginning. I know she's the vice president of the club, but it occurred to me that I needed help, and I asked her, and she is a veteran of the model, and she readily and enthusiastically said she would help. And she would help in many tasks, not just as a chair of a committee, which is really a big challenge, especially if you do not have a legal secretary. And for a short period, she was operating independently. But what I heard about the conduct of that committee was very complimentary and indicates of the good work that Rachel has done. And Rachel, of course, was our General Assembly President as well. And again, she is enthusiastic about volunteering, and I very much appreciate the work you do, Rachel. Thank you very much. Okay, so basically we're going to split. We're going to do different committees. I'm going to do one, she's going to do one. And then what we will do, we will invite the chair and legal secretary, and two of us happen to be here, to talk about our committees. Okay, and perhaps the legal secretary might wish to do that as well. And this is a good story, so a good news, bad news story, I suppose. I think it's not working. Oh, okay. So the bad news is that I don't have the actual certificates with me because I had to actually print them myself. I have all the information for them, and I'm going to be doing that around midnight, perhaps tonight, or some other time. Maybe in the morning I come in very, very early so that I'll ready them, and hopefully I can run the printer and all of that stuff. And if they do run smoothly, then I will have the stack of those awards with me. The good news, of course, is we can announce the awards, and that's really all that matters. And so we will announce those awards, and then have you come up here and basically shake the hand of the committee chair and the legal secretary, and then go back to your seat. And then await the actual certificate tomorrow. But we will share the good news with everybody, and that's really the important thing to do. So what we will do is, I guess, we will begin with the Political and Security Committee. And Kevin is the, and again, thanks Kevin. Kevin came from Minneapolis. He asked to volunteer, and I so very much appreciate his volunteering. And obviously he did a splendid job, and everything I heard was very, very complimentary. So Kevin will talk about his committee, and then we'll announce the winners for that committee. And Kevin. Oh, well, thank you. So I hope you read my
Yeah, we'll start. Okay. Excellent. It's open.
Is this on? Okay, great. Hey, first off, I'd just like to thank everybody who participated in the NGA1, basically the committee that I chaired. I know that we had it was a little bit of a rocky start yesterday, and it was also a little bit of a rocky start, but I do also, again, thank all of you guys who participated in GA1 to basically giving me the time to get everything sorted out so we could have a good conference. With that said, though, in GA1, we did pass a total of, we voted on a total of 16 resolutions, passing 10 of those and ultimately failing 6 of them. So again, I am super proud of the work that you guys were able to do between these past 2 days. So with that said here, so I'm going to start with the Best Delegate Award nominee. I honestly thought that this delegate did a pretty great job with representing the country that he did. So without further ado, The Best Delegates Award nominee goes to Raheel Richard Pereira, representing Brazil, from Minnesota State University Moorhead. Thanks. Yeah. The Best Delegate Award honorable mention goes to Alex Panam, representing India from Alex Pram. I might have butchered your last name. I'm sorry about that. But again, representing India from Mankato State University. Take that. And finally, the Best Delegate Award of the General Assembly #1 goes to Julianne Weersma, representing the Netherlands in GA1. Thank you again, guys. Finally, to recognize the rapporteur of General Assembly 1, to be fair, he was the only one who did volunteer after I did ask. So again, that is going to be a representative from India, that is Alex Ram of Mankato State.
Please welcome to the stage Lyndon Carlson, Chair of the Economic and Finance Committee.
Hi everyone. We had a really good committee session. I was really impressed by everyone's ability to ask critical questions and participate in debate. Excuse me, I kind of lost my voice from talking all weekend. I'll just get right into it. All right, beginning with the Best Delegate Award nominee, we have representing Netherlands, Adam Flores. Adam did a great job, not only participating in every resolution, but also managing the whole committee, making valuable motions and keeping us right on track with getting resolutions done and asking critical questions. Next, we have Best Delegate Award honorable mention. I don't believe he's here. He represented Hungary. Conan Bach. He is from Minnesota State Mankato. Lastly, with Best Delegate Award, representing Dominican Republic. We'll also recognize our rapporteur, since it'll be a little convenient. Hattie Seton, SDSU. But again, before I leave, I just want to say I was very impressed with my committee. This is my first time chairing, and I told them in the beginning, go easy on me, and I think we had a lot of fun, and we were also very professional at the same time. And I really appreciate everyone there.
Thank you. I heard good things about Lyndon and how he chaired, knowing that he's doing it for the first time. So, great job, Lyndon. Well, next I'm going to call on the chairperson of the Social and Cultural and Humanitarian, Rachel Iverson.
We had a great session. Let's see here. 17 resolutions were discussed and voted on. 15 of them passed. Of those passed, issues range from women's health, refugees, and mental health. I'm very proud of the work our committee did. We had a lot of hard workers, and we really showed them how it's done. Starting with Best Delegate Award nominee. I would just want to say first, each of these award winners were very neck and neck. I had the committee vote, and they were all within almost one vote of each other. So really, great job to all of you. The first is for the country of Belgium. Emmanuel. We said that he gets hugged because he's the nice one. Anybody in my committee would agree with that you are the nice one? Okay. And finally, to Best Delegate Award is the country of Denmark. Marie Now I will pass the microphone back to Secretary General Dr. Batab, who presided over the Security Council.
Thank you.
Yes, Ritchie.
Where is the legal secretary for the Security Council? Where is he? As was indicated from my colleagues on the other committees, the choice is very hard, as it always is, because most of you spend weeks and weeks and weeks preparing for this, and you come here, you really want to make sure that you get out of it as much as you have expected. Therefore, all of you do the very best you can, and so the competition is tough, to say mildly. And so it's a hard choice. And I have a scale, and this is what I pass also to the other committees. A number of things that we ought to keep in mind. One of them is whether or not the delegates have accurately and properly represented the position of their country. I think this is the most important thing. Because if you misrepresent the country, it doesn't matter how you the rest of it doesn't matter. So that's absolutely is crucial and number one, and we're looking for that to make sure that this is in keeping with the positions of the country, as what one would expect. And the second one, does the individual show preparedness? They seem to have prepared, right? I mean, you could tell, I think. And the third one is the extent of participation in the debate, caucuses, and whether or not that is consistent. Some people do a lot of participation and they're active the first day, and the second day they peter off. I must tell you, I mean, in my role, I thought I was petering out as well. So perhaps, but the consistency here, whether it's in the first day or the second day. Are they keeping it up, and are they participating in the debates and in the caucuses in a meaningful way? As opposed to, we have a caucus and they're walking around, and they think of it as a break and not a constructive time to do dialogue and to do negotiations and the rest of that. How about their effectiveness in the debates, right? Is what they say logical and logically presented so that it has an impact on those that hear it, unlikely to be convincing, right? Are they using the stronger points, so to speak, in trying to sell their resolution or their point of view? Their demeanor and the conduct. Again, this is really important because of the setting. The setting is a serious setting, right? The presumption is that we play the role of an ambassador who represents a country with serious issues, and our country has its hopes on us, its aspirations. They send us to represent them, and it's not a time for us to trifle with that or to play games or do gimmicks. So we look for that. We look to see how they respect others. When the others speak, are they busy passing around notes to the people next to them? Are they listening? Are they proactively, engaged and listening to the discussion? Sponsorship of the resolution and amendments. Right? Again, that asks, did they sponsor a resolution? Did they sponsor amendments? This is important because it also shows their desire to proactively participate. Proper use of the rules. One of the biggest problems that we have, and we've had this for years now, is that people in our region go to Chicago and then they come here. And they don't look at our rules. And in our setting, they attempt to play by the rules of Chicago. And invariably, that is really confusing for us and for our students, and as well as for them, right? Because it doesn't take them very far, and they discover that perhaps they did themselves something wrong. So, with that in mind, I thought that Haley and I will put our heads together, so to speak, and reflect on, the participation. But I thought it would be really helpful and semi-democratic is to ask the members of the council to give us feedback, basically, how they feel their colleagues have performed. And I had a little bit of a speech. I gave them a speech about ensuring that they do not act in a tribalistic way, right? They act objective as professionals, as academics and students of knowledge and of these matters. And so they need to weigh things in an objective way. So we got that, and Haley tabulated that, and we put our heads together, and we decided on the basis of that. And Haley is going to announce those awards.
All right. Well, we decided that for our Best Delegate Award nominee, that we had two that stood out to us. And the first is from USA, and it is Nathaniel Pesclo. All right, and the other Best Delegate Award nominee goes to Dakota Baker from France. From LSFU. And he is also our rapporteur. Our Best Delegate Award honorable mention, she is from Kuwait. It is Madeline Smarillo. She's not going to be here, but she is from, it seems like GAC. Okay. All right, and then our Best Delegate Award is from Belgium.
This really long stuff, and I could basically name half of the council, for awards. But again, we had to make the choice because of the limitations. Congratulations to all of you. One thing I want to say though, before I leave, because of my basically chairing the committee, I started as a solo, and it was difficult because, of course, I was also trying to run around and instruct this and do this and do that. So it was very, very tough. So I think we had a break. Probably, I don't know if it was the first session or the second session. Yeah, we had a break, and I went, and then I came back, and I had some kind of discussion going on. And evidently, they were feeling sorry for me. And so they were discussing among themselves finding somebody from the committee to actually be the legal secretary. And I said, well, that's not bad. That's a good idea. And so they volunteered for their job, and I'm very, very grateful because, as you all know, just worrying about inputting the amendments is a nightmare for somebody who doesn't see very well. I mean, truly. And she did just a super job, so I'm really very, very grateful for you being able to do that job. Okay, so basically that's the individual. I think we did all of them. Now we go back to the, to the policy speech and to the delegate award. Okay, the delegate award usually happens at the end. First, put in a grid. The performance of the policy speech in the committees, and then we go by country, and then we see which country seems to be consistently doing well in all of them. And then we decide on the basis of that. So the policy speech, basically the best award nominee goes to Canada. Where's Canada? Okay, and from St. Cloud State University, the best award, honorable mention, goes to the representative from Kuwait, and that is from Gustavus Adolphus, and they are now here, I suppose. So So we count on Mustafa to communicate basically the news for them. Inshallah. Okay, and the best award goes to Malaysia. Where's Malaysia? Malaysia is from Normandy. Where's Malaysia? Delegation, we put an aggregate performance in each of the committees, and we include also the policy speech. And this was really curious. I don't remember a year when we had this situation. And so essentially we had a big cluster of people, and then on the top too. And then there was a gap between them. And so it was the sense of the committee of advisors and chairs and legal secretaries that we would just go with the top two, because there was a gap between them and the rest. And so the honorable mention of the best award goes to the Netherlands. And the best policy speech goes to Belgium. The next delegation goes to Belgium. Where's the delegation? Belgium! What is the best delegation? Good job. Good job. Good job. Good job. Congratulations. Thank you very much. Congratulations. Tomorrow we'll They are from Minnesota State University, and evidently they are keeping a good tradition there even after Andrew has left. So I'm going to have to see where Andrew is and communicate with him, and I'm sure he will be very, very pleased. Okay, I think this is just about concludes what we have to say, but we want to do a reminder of what is ahead, and this will be for tomorrow. We couldn't open this building before 10 o'clock, so they would allow us to start at 10 o'clock. I would have wanted it to be earlier, so it would be early. And so 10 o'clock we begin on Sunday, and we probably will go for about an hour to an hour and a half. And this basically will be for the rapporteurs of the committees to provide their reports to the General Assembly. And as for the Security Council, the report is provided and nothing happens with respect to that. But the report from the committees of the General Assembly can be debated and can be voted on. So it's slightly different. A reminder that we will have an advisors meeting at 8 a.m. or around that time, 8 a.m. If you wake up early, hopefully you do, at American, because that will be convenient for us that are there. Again, thank you very much, everybody, and we will see you early in the morning.